It's great to see so many people in person. I don't raise your hand if this is your first kind of big in-person thing that you've done kind of during COVID. Yeah, a lot of people. Raise your hand if you knew that the HOA in Sanford, Florida paid the Martin family $1 million for wrongful death. Raise your hand if you knew that. 1, 2, 3 in it. We got a 3 in a possible. Are we playing spades? 3 in a possible. 3 in a possible. So we get that, right? So let's think about it like this. Room full of people. You all are academics, sociologists. You all know this stuff. Raise your hand if you didn't know this. There's so much more that we can learn.
Everyone here is smart. Distinguish yourself by being kind. That has certainly been my experience, Dr. Ray. Over the last decade, Dr. Ray has been fantastically productive and deeply engaged with a broad range of audience. He's a remarkable communicator in any number of registers. He's as comfortable and effective, as you will see here in just a moment, speaking to a room full of sociologists, a group of municipal and national policymakers, and a classroom full of undergraduates, to a rowdy crowd on Twitter, and yes, he has a blue check mark. In interviews on CNN, to a gathering of community members or in a fierce argument about pulp culture back home with friends. Honored guests, please join me in welcoming Dr. Richmond.
That was awesome. Thank you. All right, that was an amazing introduction. You know, normally people just read stuff. And so, Ryan, thank you so much. It is always great to hear what people think. And I definitely remember that presentation, always enjoy the conversations we have. So thank you for that. It's great to see so many people in person. I don't raise your hand if this is your first kind of big in-person thing that you've done kind of during COVID. Yeah, a lot of people. Did people go to Southerns? A few people? Okay. Yeah. So look, it's great to see so many of you all here today. Hopefully you all have been having a great conference, and I would definitely want to get some informalities that are really important out of the way now. I have to give a shout out to my closest friend from college, Kenji Conley, who lives in Chicago, sitting right here on the front row, took his time off from work to come hear me talk today. You always got to have your tribe and your council with you. He's been there from day one, dating back over 20 years at this point. So thank you for being here. And then I also have to, let me find her. Oh, Genesis Fuentes. Stand up, Genesis. Please stand up for me. Thank you. Yeah, give Genesis a round of applause. So Genesis is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Genesis is a PhD student at the University of Maryland. She will be on the job market soon. You all should hire her. She's phenomenal. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today came because Genesis started working in my lab as the coordinator and then decided to go and get her PhD. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today on policing is because people like Genesis and others on our team have been in the trenches doing a lot of that work. So what I'm presenting today is a team effort. And since Genesis is here today and we're finally back in person, I get to embarrass her a little bit and talk about her. She is also one of the MSS student directors. So if you all have seen her around, she's quite active. And I continue to be appreciative of all the work she does in our friendship. Even though Genesis says she will not stop calling me Dr. Ray until she graduates to get some big publication. I've been trying to get her to stop doing that, but that's neither here nor there. All right, so let's kind of buckle your seatbelts. I'm going to talk about a lot of information today. I'm going to aim to cover a lot of things in a very short period of time. And then what I hope is we'll have about 30 minutes to engage in Q&A. And when you look at this image here, this is what a lot of us have dealt with over the past couple of years with this racial reckoning. And then the retrenchment that Ryan also talked about, which we know based on attacks with critical race theory, based on attacks with trying to ban certain words like gay and other sorts of things, that we know that we are in a big battle for kind of what people might consider the soul of America. I tend to think as academics and sociologists for not only what truth is, but how we think about rigorous science and what we value that to actually be. If you look at this image here, besides one being in black and white and one being in color, I don't know about you, but I actually can't tell the differences between the two. One is from 1964, as you see. The other is from 2014. And this started a lot of the work that I started doing on policing, particularly when it came to examining data on Twitter. This is the sort of images that became very popular during the Black Lives Matter movement. But this is the sort of image that law enforcement would have us to believe really, really exists in America. One thing I know from studying law enforcement for roughly a decade is both of those things can be true. But that still doesn't mean that the image on the bottom left isn't much more problematic, obviously, and something that needs to be addressed. And simply because we have those images on the top right does not absolve law enforcement from addressing what's on the bottom left. When we think about black fatal encounters, these are the sort of statistics that have came out over the last several years. Where if you just look at whites and blacks, look at blacks first. What you see is that roughly 80% of black people, roughly 4 out of 5, say that fatal encounters with law enforcement is a sign of a broader issue, right? The sign of systemic racism. And that's typically where people stop. And they say, oh, black people are much more likely than white people to think this. But if you look at this, over 50% of white people think the same thing, too. So it suggests that there is a group of people to mobilize and be part of something that oftentimes are not being talked about. And obviously, we saw that come out during the Black Lives Matter protest with George Floyd. I think we also saw that with the Women's March. Some of the work that I've done with some of my colleagues really show the way that we have these intersectional coalitions. And part of the moment that we're in now, and what I'm worried about is this retrenchment that Ryan was talking about. I'm going to be talking about that, is that we are currently in a policy window. A policy window is when a social problem comes to the public's attention and a policy solution can be attempted with public support. We could think about slavery, convict leasing, the Great Depression, dealing with the civil rights movement, dealing with the legalization of marriage for all, and then, of course, the continued struggles of police brutality, the Me Too movement, and dealing with guns. The way that I like to think about a policy window is that it's kind of like a match that's been lit. You know, when you light a match, you only have a certain amount of time to use it, right? And then if you're like in my house where we have these big candles, right, from Bed Bath & Beyond or wherever you get your candles from, and it's went all the way down and you're trying to get that last piece of wax in, you're like, this is going to smell real good in my house. So you take the match, you're trying to go all the way down. What happens when you're trying to go down there? You burn yourself. See, that's what happens with the policy window. When people are trying to do the work and the policy window is closing, there are oftentimes casualties along the way. That's why that W.B. Du Bois quote is so profound. It's simply amazing with scholars like Du Bois writes, how you can read something from them and you're like, I think this person is still living today, because it just suggests how far we've came and then how far we still have to go. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to present you a lot of data from a lot of different projects that I've worked on over the past decade or so. A large data set on Twitter from a year in Ferguson. What did it look like to be on the ground through the lens of people who were posting on Twitter? An ethnographic observational data set on implicit bias trainings with roughly 1,200 police officers that Genesis was fundamentally a part of during that process. And then interviews that we also conducted with police officers and civilians in the Mid-Atlantic area. And then our virtual reality and computer experimental data from roughly 100 police officers. Here's the roadmap. I consider these like infomercials. So put your seatbelts on again, because I'm going to cover these points, particularly the first few, rather quickly. I think people's knowledge during this racial awakening moment have kind of scaled up. I don't have to spend as much time on that, but I will spend time particularly on the last sets of studies as I go through. Obviously, as you all know, with the evolution of Black Lives Matter, that people oftentimes talk about it in the context of Michael Brown and Ferguson. And part of thinking about this is that was the moment in which we saw a lot of catalysts and a lot of things happen. But of course, you know that the Black Lives Matter movement started with Trayvon Martin, where 3 black queer women saw what was happening with him after George Zimmerman was not convicted of murder. And they posted on Facebook and with themselves, Black Lives Don't Matter. And eventually they got to Black Lives Matter. And here we are today. Now, one thing that you probably don't know, and I'm going to ask you all to raise your hands again. It's just so good to be in person. I can actually interact with people, see people raise their hands. Raise your hand if you knew that the HOA in Sanford, Florida, paid the Martin family $1 million for wrongful death. Raise your hand if you knew that. 1, 2, 3, 3 in it. We got a 3 in a possible. Like we playing spades, 3 in a possible, 3 in a possible. So we get that, right? So let's think about it like this. Room full of people. You all are academics, sociologists. You all know this stuff. Raise your hand if you didn't know this. It's so much more that we can learn. I want you all to think about this. Probably regardless of how you feel about what happened to Trayvon Martin, and based on the people in this room, I can probably think, but sometimes we don't know, right? There's an assumption about sociologists that we got some type of political slant. I sit in a lot of meetings, and that's not always the case. But accordingly, if you think about this, regardless of probably how you feel about it, you probably would feel some kind of way if your HOA money went to pay a family because a rogue person who lives there became a neighborhood watch person and killed this boy. And I say boy because last time I checked, Trayvon Martin was 17, and you are not an adult yet. So one of the things we know from research is that oftentimes, particularly black boys, Latino boys as well, they are oftentimes aged up. It's perceived that they're older. And then the older we get, it's perceived that we're younger. And one thing I know about policing is that then actually widens the range by which we are over-policed. Not saying we don't see 12-year-olds over-policed. We know about Tamir Rice. And not saying we don't see 50 and 60-year-olds over-policed. You can look up Joseph Sushank and see what happened to him. But part of thinking about this is these are the sort of things that we didn't know. So early on, what I wanted to do with some of our colleagues was to figure out what was happening on the ground. So Melissa Brown, who is a professor at Santa Clara, she did a postdoc at Stanford. She was one of my students, phenomenal. She came to my office one day and was like, Rayshawn, it's a lot happening on Twitter. And I was like, Twitter? I was like, yeah, people just posting on stuff. It's like Facebook. She was like, no, it's not like Facebook, because this generational shift. So similar to how people today are like all on TikTok. I'll just tell y'all, I like Twitter. I like Instagram. Hit me up, post stuff. Slightly too old maybe for TikTok. I'm trying to figure it out. Somebody can give me a tutorial. I can't figure it out yet. My kids are trying to help me. But the whole point is we put together this data set with some humanists on campus in the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. We collected data over 1 year in Ferguson. So every tweet that mentioned the word Ferguson, we collected it. We scraped it. We analyzed it. So I'm going to give you all some big highlights. First big thing is there were 4 big time periods that you all are familiar with. Killing of Michael Brown. Second was the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, who was the officer who killed Michael Brown. And then the Department of Justice report, which came out in March, late February, March. And then the 1 year aftermath of his death. What are some of the biggest things we found? Well, these were some of the big images that are now commonplace, but we go back about 8 years, and these sort of things were not commonplace. Seeing people in solidarity. These were some of the images that were not as popular then, that have become more popular, but they were going on then as well. Because one of the things that happens with social media that I love about it, it allows people to circumvent traditional modes of communication. You don't have to go on CNN and get your voice out. You can actually post. You can get a following. People pay attention to you. And it doesn't even matter how big your following is. Oftentimes it matters who is following you. How influential are they? So you have to kind of think through those sort of things. Monks coming from Myanmar, and then on the bottom left and the top left and the top right, looking like something that we might actually see right now on the news that's happening in Ukraine. That was right in Ferguson, right across the line in St. Louis from where Derek Jones, one of my friends who came in, who actually drove up from St. Louis to come and watch me here today, is here where him and his brother, who was my roommate in college, Keith Jones, grew up at. This is how close and how real these sort of things are. We could also map the popularity of certain hashtags. This is showing the popularity of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. If you look at this, see, even though what started happening in September with Michael Brown was happening on the ground, it really exploded on Twitter in November of that year. That was when Darren Wilson was not indicted. This huge spike was the night that he was not indicted. If you were like me, you were probably watching TV. If you were like some people I know in St. Louis or other places, you were probably there. I remember actually looking on CNN and seeing one of my colleagues, Keon Gilbert, who's a professor at St. Louis University, and I was literally sitting there. I was calling him. I was like, where are you at? Is everything okay? Then I saw him walk across the screen on CNN. I was like, can you go home? But that's neither here nor there. The other thing we know is there were all of these protests that happened. And up until the Women's March, this was the most protest that had happened in American history at one point in time. The other thing we could do is we could track the growth of a hashtag. We could track the growth of a social movement. We don't have to go through archives like we used to, which is still very, very important for doing historical analysis, but we can document the now. And if you look at this, Black Lives Matter was not really popular at the time Michael Brown was killed, but instantly became one of the most popular hashtags, only behind Michael Brown and Mike Brown, and one more that I'm going to tell you about in a second. Some of the big themes that came out of people who were using the Black Lives Matter hashtag. So if you use that, we analyzed a subset of these. Blacks kill with impunity and whites not. So people would post images of white people who had killed people, who were apprehended peacefully, or like in the case of Dylan Roof, who had just murdered 9 people in a church. They took this joker to Burger King on his way to jail, like those sort of images. And then black people who had not killed anyone who were actually killed by police. And then also displays of activism like this one. Telling me that I'm obsessed with talking about racism in America is like telling me I'm obsessed with swimming when I'm drowning. And then, of course, displays of activism from, at the time, the St. Louis Rams, now the L.A. Rams. They just won a Super Bowl. I'm sure people in St. Louis heard over that. I'm sure they are. But you had academics like Mary Berry. You have lockdowns from D.C., people blocking streets, and what's happening in New York, to going to other places, even around the country, or even around the world, like Toronto and also in England. But as people know who study social movements, for every narrative, there is a counter narrative. The counter narrative with Black Lives Matter is not all lives matter. The media will have us to think that. Where did all lives matter come from? We have literally tried to figure out when was the origin. One of the conclusion I've came to is that it was the media trying to juxtapose that. It wasn't something organic that really came from people, but there was something organic that really came from people. And it's called TCOT. Top conservatives on Twitter. Here it goes. Second call and response. Raise your hand if you've heard of TCOT. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. So this group right here, y'all know everything. This group right here, they know it all. So 4 people. All right. So again, in this big room, that's the great thing about research and science, right? When you specialize in something, you say something that a room full of people don't know, and y'all are smart. Right? As Ryan said. So TCOT, I remember when we first started seeing it popping up, because we would get these daily digests of the top used hashtags. We just thought it was like a bot or something. We were like, what the heck is TCOT? We don't know what that is. And then it kept popping up. And Melissa was like, Rashawn, maybe we need to look at this. And it was around football time. I was like, I don't think it's a football related term. So stands for top conservatives on Twitter. This is why you need to know about it, because you already know about it. You just didn't know it was called this. They take credit for revitalizing the alt-right, or really framing things as being alt-right instead of extremism, right, in terms of white supremacy. They also take credit for cementing the Tea Party in the Republican Party. Think about it. Raise your hand if you hear much about the Tea Party today. They're still around. You know why? Because moderate Republicans became troublesome bedfellows with Tea Party Republicans. Because they knew if they actually separated from them, that they would lose a generation. The same way that on the left, that progressives and liberals, particularly moderate liberals, whether that be Joe Biden or Barack Obama, and the list could go on, they continue to be troublesome bedfellows, even though we should have multiple political parties in the United States of America. But this overly two-party simplistic system leads to moderate Republicans, or even maybe people like Manchin and Sinema, who should probably be over there, at least they're trying to be in the middle. It leads to them being troublesome bedfellows. So you don't hear about Tea Party Republicans because they've been swallowed up. And that's part of what our party has done over time. But this is how popular TCOT is. This is a word map, essentially, of showing the most popular hashtags. The larger they are, the more prominent they were in our data set. TCOT's right there. You know the reason why you all don't know about it? Because your algorithm on Twitter is completely different from other people where TCOT's popping up. And in those 32 million tweets we had, less than 0.1% of all those tweets had TCOT and Black Lives Matter in it. And I really search for them people because I'm like, they know the matrix. Like, they know something we don't know. Like, who are these people? And this is why you need to know TCOT. Look how popular it was. These are of all the hashtags. Only 4 people in here knew about it. This little group and him, right? Look at the DOJ report. TCOT was number 1. You know what it was doing? Drowning out that Department of Justice report that showed that police officers in Ferguson and that the city was profiting off of stopping black people as they were going from St. Louis out to the suburbs and back and forth. They drowned that out. That was one of their goals. And they would have images like this. This says, according to Darren Wilson, this is what happened. No reason not to believe him. Ferguson decision, Ferguson TCOT. It shows this monster figure. That's supposed to be Michael Brown. Then it shows this little person with a flag. That's supposed to be Darren Wilson. You know what's so interesting about that? Both of these men were large men. They were both 6'4", well over 200 pounds. But you know what Darren Wilson said when he was on the stand? the same sort of explicit stereotypical narratives we hear about black men. And I say men because Michael Brown had just turned 18. And I'm giving that juxtaposition because instantly, supposedly in America, you go from 17 to 18, you go from a boy to a man. You go from a girl to a woman. And we act like that these sort of things don't continue to play out. So Darren Wilson said, I felt like a 5-year-old and he looked like Hulk Hogan. And he said, he looked like a demon. Look, if you like me and my family and people who've seen this stuff and seen us posted, we love Halloween. Like my family loves Halloween. It's like a thing in my house. We post a whole bunch of stuff about it. One thing that I know about demons is there are really only a few ways to take out a demon. You got to cut his head off. You got to shoot it with a silver bullet. I say that to say because that narrative that exists that is being given to the grand jury, that he looked demonic, suggests to a grand jury that what happened to Michael Brown is justified, particularly when it is a black body that is being done upon. And that is part of what TCOT is really trying to highlight. And then talking about that if you allow Black Lives Matter to keep going, that they will eventually take over the United States of America and just end our republic and our democracy as we know it. These are the same sort of images that if you go back over time, particularly over the past 100, 150 years, when people were immigrating from Asia, from China, from Japan, these were some of the same sort of images that we would see about the group threat that exists when people pose an economic, political, or cultural threat to the status quo. So we see these same sort of things over and over again. What do police officers think about this? Well, we interviewed a lot of police officers. One of the biggest things that we found, and I'll say this now and then you'll see it later. Qualitatively, we saw some differences, but I'll go ahead and foreshadow. Police officers really aren't all that different regardless of who they are. And I'm going to make this point here, is that I want you to look at the yellow bar and the green bar. So I want you to look here and I want you to look here. These are really experienced officers, white officers, black officers, that overwhelmingly have negative views about Black Lives Matter. How negative? Well, look at this top quote. A white officer with 10 years of experience said, I think Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a domestic terrorist organization, just like the KKK, I bet you know, and they're hell-bent on seeing the U.S. burn. Yeah, just think about that. Some of you all probably have worn Black Lives Matter shirts, paraphernalia. You've probably been to something, supported something, taken some university, like public-facing picture, like, yeah, we in solidarity with all this stuff, all that kind of stuff, which I think is important, right? I'm part of that stuff too. But I say that to say that this is the framing. So what we saw last summer in D.C., where it didn't matter what color you were, and that was a very diverse group of people protesting in D.C. for Black Lives Matter after George Floyd, that was the reason why Trump was really trying to mobilize the military in the way he did, and why on January 6th, we saw a very different response, where in the state of Maryland, where, of course, I happen to be, where Governor Larry Hogan, who happens to be a Republican, in an interesting state that people think is blue, but we got a Republican governor, just keep that in mind, where he was planning to send people and troops to D.C. on January 6th, and they told him not to. This is the complications of America, where we saw domestic terrorists storm the U.S. Capitol, and so police officers were kiki and ha-ha with them, while others were trying to defend our so-called republic. Now, when we think about racializing the criminal justice system, you all know a lot of this stuff by now. No matter where we go, no matter what we look at, black people are disproportionately more likely to be arrested by the cops, stopped on the street, have force used against them, and lethal force used against them. Those are the blue bars. Completely out of whack with everybody else. And, of course, these are log likelihoods, so you can see that white people are even much less likely to be so. No matter where we go around the country, we can see this. We can look at California. And we see the disproportionality because you got to think in the state of California, people always, they always increase the number of black people they see. Like even here, people probably think it's like 50 of us in here. Like it's not. So people always overestimate. In California, it's like 6% black. So I want you all to keep this in mind when you're seeing these high percentages of what's happening. We can go to other places. We can look at Connecticut. We see the same sort of thing when we look at the green and the gray and the yellow bars. We can also go to another place and look at it the same sort of way, like in Ohio, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland. We can go to Minnesota. No matter where we go, we see it. Oakland, which is the place where I really started doing this work when I was an RWJ health policy fellow at Berkeley. We see that black people are much more likely to be stopped and questioned and searched. Now, there are some people who say, oh, well, all that makes sense because Black people just do much worse things. They're just bad. I have nothing against them. They're just, something about them. Sometimes they just do bad things. Well, when we actually look at the data, that's actually not what we find. Like, that's what I love about data. This was a large report looking at roughly 700,000 police stops in New York, height of stop and frisk. What you see here is the percentage of stops by race. You see that a third were Latino, less than 10% were whites, and slightly over half were black people. This is the number of times force was used against these people. This is the percentage of all roughly these 700,000 stops where they found contraband, a weapon, or a person who had an outstanding warrant. 2%. It becomes clear that stop and frisk policies are not necessarily about trying to prevent people from doing crime. It's about policing people who are in a particular space. This same study has been replicated as lately as of Washington, D.C., where over 90% of all the people who were stopped, who had use of force used against them, and who were handcuffed, but who ultimately were let go and were not charged, over 90% of that group were black people. See, we have to start putting this in a particular context, and what it spills over to is really, when we look at it, is what I pretty much just described is what I call trickle-down policing. The stop and frisk, the stops, the surveilling, and then it spills over into police killings, where for over a decade, over 1,000 people have been killed in the United States every single year. The pandemic did not stop that. George Floyd's murder did not stop that. Those sort of things have continued, where every 8 hours, police officers in our country kill someone. Every 40 hours, a black person is killed by police. And the disproportionality is off the charts, where if you look at the top bar, what you see, that's pretty much the percentage of the U.S. population, non-Hispanic whites for whites there, else it would be even slightly larger. You go to the second bar, only one group expands. That's black people, being 3 times more likely than other groups, than whites, to be killed by police. But then look at the bottom bar. Because, see, if it was about behavior, we would expect that bottom bar to decrease the racial difference, because that bottom bar is capturing people who were not attacking and people who were unarmed at the time police officers killed them. Who says that? Police officers. This comes from police officer reports. This data on this particular data set comes from the FBI. So this is actually data that police officers were voluntarily reporting. Y'all get what I'm saying? So in our world, that means this is a conservative estimate, right? So we would expect the gap to get smaller. Instead, it gets bigger. Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they are not attacking and when they are unarmed. That is a travesty. That is what happens in America. And a lot of people say, oh, it's because of crime. No, it's not. Not related to crime. I know when you watch the news, if you like me, no matter what city you in, like when I'm in D.C. or I get Baltimore news, or I was in Memphis a couple weeks ago, or I'm in Chicago, first 10 minutes, I'm just like, oh my gosh, the world is horrible. Do not let my kids out the house. It's a horrible place, right? Because the news really vibes off of the negativity, right? And not saying that there aren't things to address, and not saying violent crime isn't something to address, but as I'll show you in a second, that requires a different set of policy solutions to deal with. So violent crime, yeah, is there an uptick? Yeah. But for those of us who grew up in the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, oh, it's nothing compared to that. Like, we thought things were good. We were just outside playing around, like street, at least in my house, street light come on. You better be home when the street light come on. You're not home when the street light come on, you're going to get in trouble. And so we were just out. Violent crime was much worse then than it is today. But that doesn't stop the narrative about more police, about how bad the world is, all of this sort of stuff. And then here goes the key graphic for mapping police violence that shows, if you look at the orange or reddish squares, that is the police killing rate. The blue X's is the violent crime rate. If those two things were related, in other words, if as crime increased, then police killings would increase. That would make sense in theory, right? That's completely not what's happening, because if that was happening, the X's would be similar to the squares. They are two completely unrelated metrics, both that require addressing, but they cannot be addressed in the same way, which is what we've been doing. And what I'm here to talk about is how we address, how we think about those orange squares. One thing we also know is that it's not about social class either. You know, that's the thing people say. Oh, well, you know, if you're just respectable, you know, if you just engaging, as Elizabeth Higginbotham talked about, the politics of respectability. You speak well, you dress nice, right? You wear your hair okay, you're going to be okay. No, that doesn't really happen. Look at this graphic here. This is from Nancy Krieger and her colleagues at Harvard. These top two lines are black people. The bottom two lines are white people. The teal lines are people who are less affluent. The red lines are people who are more affluent. You're probably looking in, you're probably thinking this is complete reverse of everything we know about race and class, right? You see that spike in the middle in the late 60s and 70s? Those were our civil rights leaders being killed by police. That's what that is. That's the reason why a lot of them are not around today. That's that spike. Here goes the thing, though. When we think about civilian payouts for police misconduct, these killings, even though in over 90% of all of these killings that I talked about, police officers are never charged. Over 95%, actually it's more like 98% of the ones that are charged are not convicted. I want you all to keep that in mind when we blow up a Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin is the prototype. It took multiple cameras, people standing around, a young girl with her cell phone recording, and a person sitting reviewing the footage saying, I thought that the videos, the cameras in the city stalled because they were in the same place for so long. That's what it takes to get a police officer convicted in America. But that doesn't stop these these incidents from falling on your pockets. These are civilian payouts for police misconduct for some of the people I'll show you here. Corinne Gaines on the bottom right. Raise your hand, you heard of Corinne Gaines. Okay, a few more people, but still not that much. So let me tell y'all about Corinne Gaines, why y'all need to know who she is. She was a young black mother in Baltimore County, who you could see her two kids with her. She was posting on Facebook that police were harassing her. And if you know anything about Baltimore, she was probably very accurate about that. She had an outstanding warrant to appear for failure to appear for some of these type of incidents that she had been reporting about. She's in her house. She has a gun that by all accounts was legally owned. And after a series of hours of a standoff, police bust in. She is sitting in the kitchen with her son. They shoot and kill her. They accidentally shoot her son. And because of that, her son, Cody, got a $32 million settlement. And then the rest of her family got a $6 million settlement, $38 million total. When the county then said that they wanted to review this and it got scaled up to another court, the court said that the county did not have enough money to pay it. So it is currently still in limbo. Another judge came back and said they had to pay it. The county is saying they don't have the money. That's not unusual. Let's go to Nebraska. There's a group of white people known as the Beatrice Six who got accused of murder. Anybody in here from Nebraska? Yeah, oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, this MSS. I figured there was some people from Nebraska. Yeah, anybody heard of the Beatrice Six? Oh, awesome. Yeah, my Nebraska people, Beatrice Six. So as you all know, the Beatrice Six were convicted of murder that supposedly they didn't do. They got out. They got a huge settlement. And the settlement was so large that the city of Beatrice could not pay it. So you know what happened? They increased, the people living in that city increased their property taxes. That is not unusual. Let's go to Inkster, Michigan, where there was a large civil settlement. The city didn't have enough money to pay it. It dissolved their school system. There are other places where people's property taxes are increased 10% every year because they have to pay these people a wrongful civil settlement for a police incident. This is y'all's money. And then, of course, we can think about others all across the country where it's happened, large settlements. Then, of course, we know about Breonna Taylor. People know about 12-year-old Shamir Rice. And then, of course, Laquan McDonald, right here in my buddy KC's favorite city, home city of Chicago, right? $5 million. This is what you need to know about Chicago. Every city I go to, I have a slide like this because it's unfortunate I can do this in every city. I wrote an article called, as you see there, talking about the financial gymnastics of police misconduct settlements. What do you need to know about Chicago? Well, during a decade from 2010 to 2020, $528 million paid out in civil settlements. $528 million. As much as they like to talk about the south side of Chicago, the west side of Chicago, imagine how much this money could go to an education infrastructure, to a work employment plan, to getting people transportation. to getting people adequate housing, to getting people the mental health resources they need. $528,000. Oh, but it gets worse. When Rahm Emanuel was mayor, who's a Democrat, by the way, he worked for Obama. I'm just throwing this out there because right now there's this framing as if one group of people are on one side of this issue, the other group is on the other side. And as much time I spend on Capitol Hill, it is not that simple, particularly even when I go across the country in state legislatures and in cities. It is not that simple. Now, Rahm Emanuel came up with a brilliant idea. He said, you know what? He's looking at the budget. He's like, what are all these expenses that we haven't budgeted for? They were like, oh, these are civil settlements for police misconduct. He was like, wow, can we budget for them? And they were like, well, I guess we can. So for all you in Chicago, right? Like my good buddy from grad school, Jason Cummings, raise your hand, Jason. Jason Cummings, who is now at Loyola, who is the reason why, him and Tiffany Saunders, the reason why I chose to go to Indiana, because they were there before me, and I was like, well, these black people making it. I might be able to make it too. So thank you, Jason, because you were great, very influential, and continue to be for me. So thinking about the new city that you're in the budget line, money is going toward this. But guess what? Because it's so much money, they didn't have enough money to pay it. So Rahm said, he was like, well, how about we just put bonds on the open market and allow people to purchase them? Your taxpayer money is paying this back for people who purchase. Now, I know a lot of y'all know about private prisons, right, and the stocks. That's hardly nothing compared to this, because these bonds, the interest rates on these bonds are so high that you end up paying them over time. This is your taxpayer money. So what just happened in this equation? Well, what just happened is over 95% of the police officers, pretty much nothing. On the other hand, your money that should be going toward your community is paying. And then here's the insult to injury. Let's take Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her home, and black women are much more likely to be killed in their homes than all other groups of people, which is tragic in and of themselves to think about. No-knock warrants are more likely to be issued in predominantly black communities. That Breonna Taylor, who worked for the city as an EMT, her own tax money was used to pay her family for her killing. And the drywall between her apartment and her neighbor's apartment got more justice than her. The neighbors actually got something out of this. That was the conviction. Was about them shooting bullets through the wall, not into a black person. Like this is 2022. And then we have these illness spillovers of police violence. Some of the work I've done with Ali Sewell and others, we've looked at these illness spillovers, how if you live, regardless of race, if you live in an over-policed community, if you're a man, your mental health suffers. You're more likely to be depressed. You're more likely to have anxiety. If you're a woman, you're more likely to have diabetes, high blood pressure, and you're more likely to be obese, controlling for everything under the sun. And then, of course, we know, again, the trickle down is black people having the police called on them for everyday acts. Swimming in a pool, cooking at a park, studying at Princeton for finals. I mean, just all kinds of little girls, little black girls selling lemonade. Who calls the police on a little girl selling lemonade? Like, you gotta be a crude person to call the police on a little girl selling lemonade, right? And then we know just the other day, a black teenager, he out riding his bike delivering papers. You know, that's one of the classic jobs. Raise your hand if you deliver papers growing up. Yeah, look, y'all know that's a classic job, right? The first job, you throwing papers. Look, y'all smiling too. Y'all got vivid memories of throwing papers in people's yards and running from the dogs and all that. This black teenager who should be enjoying his life had a police officer track him down, drag him down. This dude is delivering papers. And then, of course, we know about Ahmaud Arbery, where the research I've done, Ben Crump has called it the Ahmaud Arbery effect, because the work that I was doing at RWJ found that black men, when you look at black men here, you see what happens with black men is that they are significantly less likely to be physically active in predominantly white neighborhoods. These are better resource neighborhoods. People say that's the case. What happens there? They get criminalized. I've written a lot of work about not wearing the hoodie and about thinking about what happens with individuals when they're just walking home and going to different places. And part of what happens is that blackness becomes weaponized. See, that's that graph that I showed you earlier. Like, why would the racial gap for police killings increase? It's only if people consider the black body as something that is threatening and that can physically harm them. And when you read police reports, which I do a lot, that is the narrative. And so part of thinking about this is while black men are out going for a jog, they're like, look, we need to do something about these sort of things. And then we think about Trayvon Martin, who was just getting a bottle of iced tea and some Skittles from the store during halftime of the NBA All-Star game. Just walking. And when I think about stereotypes, I know everybody knows the definition, but the way that I've learned to think about it through this work is that it falls into 4 primary categories: intellectual ability, physical ability, emotional volubility, and then also criminality. And when you think about stereotypes in that way, you can start to put them into these categories and see how they play out. There was a fascinating study by Trewalter, who is a psychologist at Virginia Tech. She looked at people's responses to inanimate objects or reptiles or animals and all this kind of stuff. Like, for example, raise your hand if I walked in this room right now and I had a snake on my shoulders. Some of y'all are already shaking y'all heads. I hadn't even got finished with the sentence yet. Imagine if I got this snake on my shoulders and I throw it into the crowd. Raise your hand if you're taking off running. Yeah, y'all just like I'm going. If I had 2 tarantulas in my hands and I threw one on each side, raise your hand. Oh, see, you doing a full running motion. You just raise your hand if you're gone right now. You running out, right? And so part of what happens, and one of the things that we're doing at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we are trying to actually examine people's physiological responses, which helps get beneath the skin, right? And so I'll show you all some of that in a second. But this is what this study found. This study found that the same physiological reaction that people have to snakes and spiders is the same physiological reaction that some people have to black men in close proximity, like when they're in an elevator. And it leads to incidents like this. Well, you all might have heard about this in Florida some years ago. Some of you all are nodding. This man was sitting on the ground, who you see sitting there. He had something shiny in his hand. Person called the police, said, the person kind of looks disturbed. They sitting there. A person seems to be helping them out. I think they might need some help. Police showed up. Who do you think police helped? You think they helped the man who was having mental health issues, who's sitting down, or the black man who was his caretaker, who was coming to take him back to the group home? Shot the black man. And when they asked the police, who was hiding behind a pole, like, it was very puzzling. He was slightly outside the right view. He was hiding behind a pole. They asked him, why did you shoot him? He said, I don't know. Like, well, I know. Because then we look at images like this, where clearly the man with the gun on the left is the agitator. The guy behind the cop is like, this dude has a gun. Police doesn't even have his hand on his gun. He's going for the gun, trying to calm this guy down. I mean, this is the juxtaposition. And as much as we talk about implicit bias, which is how we started our work, one thing we learned is that explicit bias, of course, is alive and well in America, if you didn't know. But part of this is highlighting what? What I've aimed to start articulating is structural implicit bias. Structural implicit bias is when implicit bias is deeply embedded in organizational culture and lead to structurally imposed racial disparities. Everyone gets on board about the implicit bias, from the way that police officers talk to one another about what they should say in a report, about what gets scaled up, about what gets released to the public, that everyone gets embedded and it starts to shape people. And the structural embedding of implicit bias leads to a justification of the use of force against black people. And that becomes one of the ways we think about it in policing, because it happens everywhere, right? We all do it. The difference with policing is they are oftentimes put in situations to make very, very quick decisions. I think they have the most difficult job in America, not just because of the climate, but literally I think they have a very, very difficult job, because oftentimes what they are trying to do is they have situations where they show up and they only have this much information, like in this bottle. They're trying to fill up the rest. And the problem is that they're moving so fast that they fill up that bottle with bias, implicit bias and or explicit bias. How do we know this? Because we conducted a lot of implicit bias trainings with police officers. I'd done a lot of trainings with organizations and corporations and universities before, and we scaled that up and added to it to get to do an implicit bias training course. And one of the big things that we found out is that police officers have a lot of bias against black people. Not surprising. But the extremeness of it is one of the most interesting things. What you see here, this is not a mistake. This was from a recruit class, a large, diverse recruit class, diverse across race, diverse across gender, diverse across education. And what we found is that police officers are much more likely to have a bias. You all have taken implicit association tests, right? They make the association between black people and weapons closer, stronger than they do white people with weapons. So we took that and we said, you know what? How can we think about this? How can we collect data, and how can we hopefully improve things at the same time? So we developed a virtual reality decision-making program with some of our colleagues in computer science. There's a merger between sociology and computer science. And we went out and we developed over 90 scenarios. Genesis is probably having flashbacks like, no, Rayshawn, don't talk about this. It was like, this is a lot of work. It was like a whole lot of stuff going on. And we developed over 90 virtual reality scenarios focused on suspicious persons and pullover stops. We would go out, right? We would film stuff. If you all know Long Doan, who's a professor at Maryland, that's him there. We would go out and do a bunch of stuff and be out filming these different sorts of things. But then we upgraded and started working with Jigsaw, which is a subsidiary of Google. And we helped to develop a virtual reality training program. And part of what this looks like is what you can see here. This is Connor, another amazing PhD student. He's about to be on the market soon too, people. He's from Ohio, I'm just saying. So Connor, as you see, he's demonstrating. In the background, you can see what he's seeing through the goggles. It's kind of hard to see, but on that right side, it is a checklist of what officers should be looking for, training officers should be looking for, and the officers going through it. We developed a series of these scenarios. Part of what happens is that the algorithm responds in real time to the police officer. And we have a whole bunch of scenes, domestic person scenes, suspicious persons, mental health, traffic stops. And one of our big contributions was varying what the person looked like. So we took the same voice, and we made the person you see there, Barb, we made her black, right? And we did the same thing throughout the scenarios. We would also have, oh yeah, here goes a close-up for you to see it a little bit better. You can walk in the house, you can interact, you can do all sorts of different things. We had officers fill out a police report. They would tell us what they thought about the scene. So what did we find? Well, we would give them the implicit association test. Big thing, and we would also give them the explicit bias test, which, well, a scale, the symbolic racism scale. As you see here, officers hardly don't vary at all. It doesn't matter. Race, gender, age, education, where the department was, they are very, very similar people. Because in policing, it is a selection effect about who choose to go in. They really want to help people, but they also have some other characteristics that can be problematic when these sort of things play out. When we look at implicit bias, again, very little difference. These police officers are the same because, as sociologists, that's what we do, right? We take a data set, we go in and we see how people vary demographically. These people don't really vary. They're similar people. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to study policing, not only because of this issue, but also because it's very, very difficult to collect data on them. That's something that we are experts in. You all should ask, again, Genesis. Like, she knows all this stuff. Now, the other big thing that we found that was interesting, we're still sorting through, implicit bias and explicit bias hardly have no correlation at all. Like, 0.3. So all of this hoopla about what we do with this is very clear that it's much more complicated. But one thing that we do know, this is what I love about being a sociologist, social context really, really matters. So I want you all to look at across these three different types of scenarios. A house scene, person called the police because there was a domestic disturbance. People were being loud. A store, a clerk called and said that they had just been robbed. And then a bus stop where a person called and said, I think somebody just got into a fight. Okay, that's what they hear in dispatch and some other stuff. I want you all to look at the red bars. Those are important. You see two that are low, one is high. The scale here is measuring deference. You can think about deference as respect. It's a measure that we get out of the data that shows essentially how respectful police officers were. So if you look at this, you look at the house and you look at the bus stop. Black men are really low, so they got less respect, less deference. Makes sense, right? But then in the house scene, they got more. What's going on there? How does that make sense? Well, let me tell you how. We ask officers on a scale from 1 to 10, what is the perceived criminality or victimization of the people in each scene? And if you see in the store, they perceive that the person was clearly the victim. So at that point, all of a sudden, the black person gets treated similarly, if not slightly better, right? I do think if we had gender in that scenario, because it was only men in that scenario, that we would have saw something there. But the whole point is that we see in the house scene and the bus stop scene, when there is suspicion, when officers don't have a lot of information or they get the wrong information, when they haven't filled up their bottle and they have to make a quick decision, that's when implicit bias goes on steroids. Where are we going from here? Well, look, we can measure a whole bunch of stuff. This is part of what we're aiming to do. We're going to measure heart rate, stress through speech or saliva. We can track their weapons. We can also track their eyes. This is the upgrades that we are doing to be able to provide some of the best data on some of these issues. So what should we do about everything I've talked about? Well, look, I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff out that has me thinking as I, continue to write this book that I keep talking about I'm going to write, is that we need a bad apples list, but we also need good apple protections. One of the things we've realized through all of our interviews and ethnographic observations and meetings with police is that the ones who want to do well, they get pushed down and they get pushed out. They get stigmatized for speaking up. They get transferred out. They start having officers not respond to them when they're in danger. I mean, real things that, like, you got to think, if you were in that situation, what would you do? You know what a lot of people do? They keep their mouth shut. So the blue wall of silence does not exist because of the brotherhood and the sisterhood. It primarily exists because if you try to crack it, there are real consequences for doing so. We also can talk about defund the police and reallocating funding. I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think that is warranted. We can also think about civilian representation on police misconduct boards to ensure that people in the community, that the money that you're paying for all this stuff, that you start playing a better role in that process. Not just having it be created for the sake of it, but have it like in Nashville, whereas in Nashville what happens is that they have representation on the actual board and they vote on what happens to officers with police officers. That's what I think community policing and building looks like. A duty to report when something happens. I've already talked about that. I think there needs to be state level oversight for officers to report so that they don't get stigmatized. And then we can also talk about housing for officers as well as mental health training. And I can talk through some of the work that we've been doing with police officers. But the big thing is we need to really restructure these civilian payouts for police misconduct. I think what needs to happen is police departments and individual police officers need to have malpractice insurance. That money should not be coming out of your pocket. Instead, what should happen, the police department should take the money. Oh, yeah, because I left out something really important when I was talking about this. You know, I was talking about the budget and the police and how much all this stuff costs with the money. The money for police misconduct settlements does not even come from the police budget. It is on the outside of that. So this budgeting in Chicago that they do, that's not part of the police budget. That's an addition to. The bonds are in addition to. All that makeup is there. If it was an insurance model, now all of a sudden that is being included in the police department budget. And of course, as you know, as they mess up, that increases. And then I do think officers need individual liability insurance similar to what's happening in Colorado. And I think it's going to expand to other states in terms of ending qualified immunity. But even without that, the insurance will be good. And look, police officers, I think they're underpaid and overworked, I'll tell you. And people oftentimes see things, they see these police officers making all this money. I see that and I'm like, I bet that person working 100 hours a week. You all know like I know. If y'all are trying to finish comps, you trying to get a paper out, you trying to submit your MSS submission to come and present, and you high on Starbucks, like you just jittery, like what you gonna do, right? You don't even have a weapon. So imagine all of a sudden you got to make a quick decision and you get a weapon. So they're oftentimes put in situations that they are simply gonna fail in those situations, and it falls oftentimes on the bodies of the most marginalized, which in the United States has always been and continues to be black people. And these are the sort of things that we need to change. So I'll stop there, and we got a lot of time for questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about the liability insurance? I'm fascinated by this.
Yeah.
And maybe what some of the places that have tried it, how have they structured it, and what's the reaction been from the police themselves?
Great question. I love this question. It's one of the reasons I put it last, because I'm like, maybe somebody will ask me a question. I can keep talking about this when I'm running out of time. So this is the thing. Yeah, so how I got to this idea, and there are others who have been talking about it, but I've really been one of the ones writing about it. How I got to this idea is when I was doing research on these police misconduct settlements in smaller places that did not have the money, like the ones I described. There's another group that also does not have the money because they're small. And instead what they have is a risk pool with other municipalities that includes law enforcement because they're part of the city. And what would happen in those places is when an officer would do something like taking East Tennessee, these two officers pulled a person who was riding on a motorcycle on like I-40, pulled him off of his motorcycle, beat him up real bad. It was a huge settlement. The insurance company said, well, look, if you all don't fire these people, we're going to drop you from the risk pool. You know what happened? The mayors in those other cities called that mayor and said, you got to fire them. And guess what? They got fired. So when I read that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me keep doing research. And as I kept going down that rabbit hole, I found that small places either have nothing or they have this risk pool. And that risk pool has actually led to a lot of officers being terminated. And it also stops the people in that area from having to pay for it. So what would this look like? Two models. On one hand, it would simply look as a police department for the police department to carry, because the police department already carries insurance for a whole bunch of stuff, vehicles, weapons, all kind of stuff. We have to ask ourselves why they also don't carry the insurance for actually hurting the people who they're supposed to be protecting, right? And so they already have the insurance. So accordingly, the police department insurance could be expanded or they could get an additional one, but the police department should have it. And this is why. Because if the police department doesn't have it and the officer only has it, then they're simply going to pass the buck to that person. They're going to fire that person. They're going to put it all on them. And guess what that's going to mean? That individual person, that individual officer's liability insurance is not going to nearly cover the settlement that should be made. So now you take the 32 million or however much George Floyd got, around the 30 million mark. And because, again, you got to think with these settlements, you all know, like, lawyers take a large percentage, right? So you got to think about these settlements by the time they trickle down, that there's no way that an individual officer's liability insurance will cover that, but a police departments can. So part of what I've noticed is that officers have a lot of internal accountability, but a lack of external accountability to the people they engage with. They have a lot of internal accountability. They wreck their car, they get in trouble, like in big trouble. You do something like that. But you kill somebody and it's like, well, let's talk about, like, maybe we can get you out of that. But you wreck your car, it's like, come in, you're on the desk. Like, I mean, the structure is really, really strange. So the police department would carry the insurance. They would budget for it in the line. And what should then happen is that the municipality should ensure that the police budget does not continue to increase. See, this is where we get into the reallocation of funding, the defund the police movement. See, when I hear defund the police, it's not simply about taking money away from police. It's about how we think about which type of monies should be taken away. Because when you look at their lines, their budgets, there are certain things that maybe should actually increase, like mental health services, or maybe they should outsource that. That's what I call shifting. So in Colorado, you were asking who's done this. Colorado is one of the best examples. In Denver, what they do is, what they currently passed as of now is officers have to get a $25,000 insurance policy, and they pay up to a certain percentage of the civil settlement, because even though we're talking about the super large ones, there are so many more that are $100,000, $200,000 payouts where police officers done something they shouldn't do. And here goes the kicker. As much as we look at the major metropolitan areas like Chicago, there are more civil settlements in smaller places than there are in larger places. So, in short, that would kind of be the structure. But I really think the police department has to have it and the officers have to have it. But in the policy space, typically what that means is they're going to pass one and then they're going to try to pass the other. And that's just the way policy works. It's very simplified and streamlined. Oftentimes you don't get these mega bills like we used to get back in the day. Yes.
So I have a concern, actually rotating around this. I am training to be a CRSS, and I will be going out with the police department and responding to calls here soon.
Where at? In where?
Aurora and Carpentersville.
Got it. Okay.
So suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
But what I am concerned about is my company. I have the insurance.
Yep.
If something's worse say to happen, not just physically but mentally as well, and that is why we have it. I'm concerned because if I am working with police officers, that maybe make the situation worse, or possibly have a situation that ends up with bodily harm, and then I'm liable for it.
Yeah.
If that department doesn't have it. And I'm
Yep.
genuinely concerned and curious if that is something that is going to be implemented with the 590 crisis grant that we just got.
Yeah, I'd be worried too. And the thing, well, first off, that's such important work, and it's hard work, right? And people really don't realize what it's like to be in the trenches like that. I would say the model to look at, and I'm sure you're familiar with, but I'm telling this for everyone else, is let's go back to Denver. It's the STAR program, where what they're doing, there are different models, but what they do in Denver is there are a subset of calls that they go out for. These are calls where no violence has been reported and where no weapon has been reported. And they are coming out pretty much to respond to a mental health crisis. And to date, they have had 0 fatalities and 0 arrests. Okay? What is the setup when they go out? They have an officer that goes with them. That officer is backup if they are called in. But the staff of like what you're talking about, EMTs, mental health specialists, they go out together and deal with the situation primarily through communication. That's what our virtual reality program is aiming to do, is to get officers to communicate more before they escalate force. So that model has been extremely successful. It's starting to be replicated. I have seen, like in Montgomery County, Maryland, we had a group of officers come in, and they are a specialty mental health unit. I think they are the exception and not the rule. I've never seen, Genesis, she's nodding her head because she remembers this, where an officer came in, and I've never seen in the virtual reality someone kind of be able to kind of talk down the scene, if you will, and instantly knew that the person might actually have a mental health condition, right? Might actually be, say, autistic, for example, and recognize that. But I think they're the exception and not the rule. They have to be trained a lot. So I tend to think that it's in process, in the order of how many officers come out, ensuring that they're going to be trained, and also ensuring what role do they play. Are they clearly backup? When are they called in? Because this is the other thing about police. Police perceive threats very differently from normal people. And some of those threats are valid, and some of them are simply not. But one thing I know from working a lot with them and being with them for years, they have a very, very rational reason for being scared of a whole bunch of things, because they see just a whole bunch of horrible things. Like, for example, we were doing this implicit bias training one time, and we went in there, and it was a good vibe. Like, we got to a good place. Because working with them is difficult. We got to a good place, and this was at the training facility, and a training officer walked in. It was a wall of people's faces. We got didn't know what the faces were for. Officer came in, took out some tape, put tape on the back of the sheet, plastered on the wall. It was a face of person. The entire room, the whole vibe changed. And we were like, what just happened? And they said those are all the officers across the country that have died in the line of duty since we started going through the training academy. I want you to think what that would do to you. We've also seen officers get shot with red pellet guns in the dark during training and forced to wear the red stains on their uniform for a week, letting people know that they have been shot. How do you think that goes? So these are the sort, we've seen officers nearly run out of a room because a dog started barking in a training simulation. Then that gets to the mental health stuff with them that we don't talk a lot about, where one thing that we know, and it just kind of triggered this, is that 80% of officers suffer from chronic stress, right? Like relationship problems, memory loss, easily angered, sleeping problems. Here goes the kicker. Roughly 1 out of 6 reports thoughts of suicide and substance abuse. This comes from a large data set of about 8,000 police officers. 90% of them never seek help. Hurts people really, really hurt people. And when they racist, they really double down on it. When they sexist, they do the same thing too. And so, that is the big thing. And so I think, back to your question, that STAR program is phenomenal. And it is, as you know, doing this work is really hard negotiating with the process. Because, see, what police officers perceive, it's kind of like the whole narrative about taking away people's guns. I'm from Tennessee. It's like, man, nobody trying to take your guns, man. We want you to have a serial number and know where it's coming from. But you go down this path. So police are like, oh, you're coming in. You're taking a budget line away from us. That's what they perceive. And they're like, these other people over here are trying to take a budget line for us. And then what they see are things like the work I've done in Los Angeles, say with the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department and the police department and the community college, where they literally pulled the contract for the sheriff's department to work with the community college. And police are like, see, look at that. You know how many people just lost their jobs? So, you have all these things that come together, and it's really, really complicated. But the mental health thing is a big deal, because in any city, anywhere from 30 to sometimes 60%, depending on the mental health in that city, that calls from people deal with mental health. We go 1, 2, and then I'll go with Gary. Yeah, go ahead.
Are the mandatory housing subsidies for officers, is that aimed at getting them to actually live in the communities they're policing, or is there something else behind that?
No, you hit the nail on the head. So the question was, is the housing subsidies to get them to live where they police? Yes. One of the big things we found, Genesis is really interested in this. We talked about this a lot, is that one of the things that happens is that white officers are much less likely to live in the neighborhoods that they police. They're much more likely to live in the suburbs and in rural areas. In some regards, that's valid, right? Like they want to detach, they want to get away. The problem, though, is that they're not familiar with those communities. So when they talk about community policing, when I think about community policing, I think you experience the community. You live there, you send your kids to school there, you shop there, you exercise there, you go to restaurants there. Where do they do that at? Oh, they do that primarily in the suburbs and predominantly white places. They don't do it in the black places, right? Even in areas that are more affluent, they still don't do it. Because as you all know about Maryland, Prince George's County is the most affluent black county in the United States. They still don't live there either. So it's not about the class thing. It's literally about the race thing. So you can look at other cities, and Philly has a lot of problems, but they have a model. And in Jersey, they've started to do this because there are some good examples in Camden and Trenton where they essentially did what a lot of people might call abolish the police. They didn't just abolish it and left it alone. They abolished it and built it back up. I think those are two forms of abolishing because, as the title of my talk is, bad apples come from rotten trees. If you've had a rotten tree, it's only one way to deal with it, right? So when we think about that, they require officers in like their first, say, 3 to 5 years to live in the municipal area. And I think that that's warranted. The other thing I know is that similar to teachers, in most major cities, police officers cannot afford to live there. That's the reason why they work so much overtime, because we see officers that are, I guess, like my age now, who they've been a police officer for a long time. They got teenagers. They're thinking about college, and they're like, my salary is not going to do that. So what am I going to do? I'm going to work a whole bunch of overtime. I'm going to pick up a part-time job. Now I'm working 100 hours a week, and somebody says something, and I'm set off. And now I'm in a difficult situation because I'm trying to pay for my kids to go to college. You know, those are the real concerns. We can offset this by giving them housing subsidies, which I think is a good thing. They kind of get it already. If you move into an apartment complex, or some police officers move into a community that has a strong HOA, they get incentives for leaving their car on the street, for being in the community to do different things. And I think it's a good thing. I don't think it has to be forever, but I do think it should happen. Now, some people are probably saying, well, Rayshawn, how does that work with the defund the police argument? Well, this gets back to how we think about defund or reallocating, meaning taking money away, versus shifting within the budget. I'll show you all this real quick, help it make sense. This is Dallas. I want you all to look at what they pay for and what they don't pay for. Go all the way, just go down to the bottom. You ain't got to start. Just go all the way down to the bottom. Departmental support, which is what? Stuff for the officers to treat them like human beings, right? To treat them like they're real people, that they have mental health problems. Look at community outreach. You know why police talk about community policing? Because look at that line second to the bottom. They don't get anything for it. So you all probably hear police say it's like, they're just talking. That's just a talking point. No, it's actually them telling the city, give us more money to actually get out of our cars and go around and do stuff. So if we want to, this is me being a researcher, a rigorous scholar, trying to be objective, saying, what is the best way to solve this? Well, housing becomes one way. We do it for other professions. I think we should do it for them too. It will also make it where they don't have to work the 100 hours. Now they're only working 40, 50, or 60. That's manageable, obviously. And now they have more time in their community. They feel better mentally and emotionally, and I think they'll do a better job. Yeah, go ahead.
Given the importance of intersectionality, are there unique things that you have found in your research about the experience of officers?
So given how we think about intersectionality, are there things specific about officers of color? Oh, yes. And even we could bring in intersectionality even more. Think about race and gender. You all should talk to Genesis about this, because Genesis was tasked with doing most of the interviews for women of color. When we did this, one of the big things we realized when we did interviews early on was we had to do race and gender matching. Like the white dudes, they just wouldn't say certain things to me. Like they just wouldn't. And they knew that junk wouldn't ride either. I can't lie. So they knew not to say certain things to me. But they would tell Connor, right? And vice versa. When I would be interviewing a black officer, Latino officer, they would say things to me. When Genesis would be interviewing a woman, they would say things to her. Because, see, police officers are very relational people. If you think about it, they actually interact with a lot of people. They do amazing things every day. They just think it's normal because it's just part of their job. And so, look, burnout is more extreme. They're more likely to be reprimanded for doing similar things that white officers do. They are less likely to be promoted particularly the specialty units, because these specialty units is typically how they're going to move up, how they're going to get noticed, how they're really going to get promoted internally. And one of the other biggest things that we find with thinking about officers of color is that, everybody talks about they want to increase the diversity of police force. Y'all are probably looking at this saying, you just showed us that they really don't vary all that much. That's true. But that doesn't mean that their presence at policy tables where they're typically not, it doesn't mean that their presence doesn't make a difference. So once they go up the ranks, I found that in more diverse departments where they promote women and minority officers, their policies are different. When they have a black police chief, certain things are different. That doesn't mean that they don't have to perform surgery on how bad policing is in their city. But that does mean that it starts to go along. I think we can kind of think about Minneapolis like that. Like every time you look up, Minneapolis just getting hit over the head. It's so many things that happen. And it has a lot of issues long term that is now being unpacked. And I think Department of Justice consent decrees are a big deal that changes a lot of stuff moving forward. Gary, go ahead.
Okay, we're in Chicago, and listening to your talk, I can't help but think about Everett Hughes and Hughes's concept of dirty work and how society provides the need for certain occupations to do things that people don't want to hear about.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, in terms of thinking about organizational culture, how that concept is applicable to the issues that you're talking about in terms of thinking about bad apples and rotten trees.
Wonderful question. The great Gary Allen Fine, y'all. That question, boy. I tell you all, when I was in Indiana, Jason, you might remember this. Gary came to give a talk, and I don't know if you remember this, Gary, but you said it, and a couple other, like Michelle Newman also said it, talking about the way that you all view culture and what you all do in your work. And I remember you talking about how early on in your career, people were like, maybe you shouldn't focus on that, or this isn't what you should do. And now it's like, of course, if you are doing this kind of work, you're citing him. And I remember that really impacted me in terms of saying, okay, you really have to get through some barriers and challenges when you're doing innovative work. Because even in sociology, we get rung up on things looking the same, being the same. Okay, you just add a variable and get a publication. Well, that's great, but how are you really advancing science beyond that? So thanks, Gary, and great question. So look, the thing about policing, we've seen so many things that I would consider to be dirty work. I think policing is. I guess the best way to think about it in policing terms is the warrior versus guardian culture, the mentality that they have. They think about their jobs as being warriors, as protecting the community. I always ask, which communities? Because typically you're talking about protecting communities that they're in, or oftentimes predominantly white and affluent communities. Oftentimes they might not even be talking about rural and white communities. They're talking about protecting certain communities. So then the dirty work spills over. And that's part of the spillover language to those individuals who are in those other communities. The guardian mentality, on the other hand, is suggesting that they need to be guardians, which is different from being a warrior. And I think the dirty work that police do, things that people will never know about, that they never see, and this is part of the mental health part, really taints them and impacts them over time. In a way, like take the protest. We've been doing a series of interviews over the past couple of years, and all of them talk about the trauma of the protest. So, earlier I showed you all that roughly 80% of white officers with over 7 years of experience, so more senior white officers, view Black Lives Matter as the KKK. Well, when you unpack that, they make those statements and then they say, yeah, I was called in while I was at a cookout with my family on a Sunday afternoon at my little girl's birthday party. And by the time I get my gear on, my riot gear, and I show up in the city, there is a CVS burning in front of me, and somebody is throwing rocks and all kind of stuff in my head. And all I see is a Black Lives Matter shirt, even if that person is just standing over here. And they said, even if we can juxtapose, and then they'll make statements and they'll say, when people are protesting, we don't think it's the people in our community. We think it's other people. And I think that helps them mentally to think that a person who they're looking at in their eye didn't do what they just saw. And so I think we have to be real about that. But we also have to be clear that over 90% of Black Lives Matter protests have been nonviolent, right? That, white extremist protests are much more likely to be violent. But, Gary, back to your question, the dirty work, it definitely happens. And I think what a lot of people should do is go through a police civilians academy. I think that will really give people a lot of insights to what's going on. Personally, I have a lot of police officers in my family. My great uncle was the first Black chief of police of my hometown of Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I have an uncle that's a cop, a cousin that's a cop. Like, I come from people in the military, people in the police. Like, my mom got into West Point in the 70s. Like, this is like my legacy. My granddad, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, got presidential commendations. What's fascinating, what I love about sociology, those things I just said have nothing to do about how I got to this place with my research. It was very organic, but I do know one thing. Those things have allowed me to have conversations with police when they have a particular view of me. And I do think that it's allowed me to humanize them and empathize with them in the roles that they're in. So, I mean, that dirty work is real. I definitely want to keep talking to you about that because I think it's something that I've been toying around with and talking about in a way and trying to figure out the balance of how to talk about it. Because there are a lot of people who just think, there are some people who don't think that we even need police. It's actually a much smaller group than we think, but maybe among us as sociologists, it seems like a much louder group than it actually is across the country. But I do think that there are some real changes that can be made in policing, and I think it's a lot of things that we can do about it. I think we might have time for one more question if anybody has something. Oh, yes.
Can you speak more about the civilian representation on these misconduct boards? Because I feel like eventually it could turn into a diversity, equity, inclusion facade or look that way, but the things aren't really happening. So can you speak more about that?
Yeah, really good question. So how do we think about civilian review boards? Well, I think what you just said, I think most of them are that way. I think most of them are a DEI checkoff. This is how you know whether or not, here goes a trick. If you work with law enforcement and you say something about an idea, policy change or whatever, and you talking to the police chief and the police chief says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's get on board with that. You didn't push hard enough. You said nothing that's going to move the needle, like nothing at all. Right. So if a person says they want to start up a civilian review board, most police chiefs are excited about that until you go to a place like Nashville, because I've served on these and I've served on police chief selection committees. And the thing about those, and that's the thing, in your own city, you should volunteer for those things. Like, you should get involved because not only should you vote because the mayor or county executive oftentimes appoints the police chief, but you should volunteer to be on those committees as a civilian, as a citizen, to be on these committees for who's selected for these positions, right? So the ones that don't get it right, what happens is there's a use of force incident. The police makes a determination. And this is another reason why I said there's a lot of internal accountability. Police departments have what are called trial boards or police misconduct boards. Kind of think about them like judges, like an appellate court. It's like 3 of them. There are some departments that have a lot, but typically it's a small number. And they serve as judge and jury over officers. Well, you can think about how a network might matter for that, right? Like who I went to. So Jason and I, we went to academy together. So he comes through and I'm like, maybe I just give Jason, maybe we figure out how to give him a slap on the wrist, right? Maybe we give him desk duty. We don't take away his pay. Like, those are the kind of things that happen. And that's part of the reason why the black officers get hit harder, because they don't have those same networks, right? That's the reason why women get hit harder. They don't have those same networks. They don't have a good old boy network when they just go in and hang out. The civilian review boards then get that ruling and say whether or not they agree with it or not. You know what just happened? It has no impact at all. It's just hot air. Comparatively, like in Nashville, where the Community Oversight Board, COB in Nashville, they got money from the city to fund their board. The director is paid. Their assistant directors are paid, right? They get $1 million a year from the city. This is a big deal. Like, as a native Tennessean, I'm proud of this, right? They get $1 million. And then they also get votes on the Police Misconduct Board as part of COB. COB always gets votes. You know what that does? That increases accountability, transparency, and equity. And that's what we need. That's what we want. And so I do think people are starting to figure this out. Like in Maryland, I testified on the Maryland Police Accountability Act. It's the most transformative piece of legislation. And one thing we've been working on for a long time are these civilian review boards that's now required. And now we're going back, pushing in local jurisdictions for them to have civilian representation on those sort of things. And that's part of how I got to that place with testifying. Like it was organic. It wasn't like I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to go testify on this kind of stuff. It was that my research suggested what path people might go. And for me, it's about helping people on all sides of the aisle have the best information and data to make the decision they make. They have their own politics. They were elected to be Democrats or Republican and everything in between. But I think they should have the same info. And the big thing I've learned is when I get in the room and I talk to them, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, and I say otherwise because when you get local, that's when you really get the differences. If you live in a red area, you can probably run Republican, even if you're not super Republican. If you're in a blue area, you're going to probably run Democrat, even if you're not super Democrat. So and then when they scale up, Marco Rubio is a good example of that. Like, go back and look at some of the stuff he did early on in his political career, not the stuff you all know him for now. Like, for example, Marco Rubio is the co-sponsor with Congresswoman Frederica Wilson of the Commission on the Status of Black Boys and Men. Go figure. Y'all are probably like, what? That sounds crazy. Like, only if you don't know its history. So you need that representation on these boards. It's so important. And whenever you can share your research with policymakers, with the public, you should do so. You are not going in there necessarily to advocate for a position. You are going to say, this is what the research shows. I want you to have the objective information to make the best decision. And then it gets good because then they do start asking you what you think. And I hope you should have an answer for that. So thank you all for your time. Thanks for being here.